apologies for coming in a few minutes late with technical difficulties. I think what I have to say follows very well with what we just heard from Nima. So I'm going to dive right in. There's probably many themes to pick up here, but what I wanted to focus my comments on was, the core morally rooted aspiration of the protests and the politics of human rights, the international politics of human rights, that have contributed to kind of silencing those aspirations to date, and some of the dynamics that could lead to that core morally rooted aspiration or struggle once again becoming muddled. So struggles for rights can sometimes be morally complex, and although they're not understood to be. And not to say that there isn't complexity here, but I want to argue that anyone who has visited Iran or has been following Iran over the last few decades, and since over the tenure of the Islamic Republic, has seen that there is a very simple story at the heart of present and past episodes of popular protests. There is considerable clarity in that those protesting are quite simply rising up against a brutal regime that has significantly limited their freedom and institutionalized discrimination, impacting virtually every realm of their lives. So I want to talk about, again, how international politics and the international politics of human rights contribute to obscuring this very simple account. And again, I want to leave aside that it is simple, but of course it's not simple too. There's complexities here, but at the core, again, I'm arguing that there's something that can easily be obscured. So going back to the 1970s and the revolution, so one of the few things that united the disparate political forces and ideologies that participated in the 1979 revolution was their anti-imperialist commitments and their desire to challenge Western and primarily American hegemony. And so the Islamists were able to consolidate their power after the revolution, branded their rule and the religious authoritarianism that they instituted as anti-imperialist. And they did this quite effectively. Their response to the Western domination of the past was a constructed and mandated Islamization from above. And one of the most central and visible symbols, of course, of this project was the mandatory hijab. At the same time, internationally, the loudest discourses around human rights and women's rights in the Middle East from the 1980s to the 2010s originated from the West and were mired in traditional Western saviorism, civilizational hierarchy, and Islamophobia, all of which were in turn used to either obscure or justify often very devastating Western policies in and vis-a-vis the region. Not least among them were military interventions. The presentation and discussion of human rights and women's rights in this form, vis-a-vis Iran and the rest of the region, was decontextualized, dehistoricized, and depoliticized. So, of course, when it came to Iran and discussions of human rights and women's rights, missing in the discussions was the 1953 British and American orchestrated coup that overthrew, the only democratically elected and democratically minded leader Iran ever had, arguably, as well as other forms of hegemony in the region and their role in the trajectory of Iranian history. But obviously, there was very little consciousness of that amongst those who are deploying this brand of human rights, this brand of saviorism in relation to human rights and women's rights in the Middle East. So there was a very simple answer to the suffering of Middle Eastern populations, particularly women, their backwards culture and religion. Over the last decade, there have actually been, I think, important strides towards countering this traditional form of Western saviorism, or what Batua has famously called the savage victim savior metaphor of human rights. Yet the problem is that the indictment of traditional saviorism has often given way to another form of Western saviorism, one that is fixated on Western injustices and moral wrongs. So much so that it's simply incapable of seeing the local ones. So weary of reproducing the hollow deployments of human rights and women's rights used, at least in part, to justify the invasion of Afghanistan, the Iraq War, and Islamophobia globally, these voices in the West essentially steer clear of rights and freedom narratives vis-a-vis the Middle East or discussion. So this kind of, I'm still trying to figure out what I want to call it, but as a working description, anti-imperialist or progressive Western saviorism was like the traditional saviorism, one-dimensional, essentializing, and despite its adherent sense of solidarity with local populations, far removed from those populations' lived experiences of subjugation at the hands of their ostensibly anti-imperialist regime. So this, in a sense, was and remains kind of the double curse of Western hegemony in the Middle East and beyond. The regime's anti-imperialist claims, combined with traditional Western saviorism, and again, this progressive form of Western saviorism, have to date largely worked in tandem to silence, overshadow, and muddle the essential moral stance of Iranians and Iranian women when they have tried to take on the regime and its repression. Iranians have had to maneuver within this very limited space available to them amid the state's repression, the isolation of sanctions, and the effects of this international human rights politics. So in these protests, I see Iranians and Iranian women leading the protests as not just taking on their brutal repressive regime, they're also taking on the international politics of human rights that has in many ways worked against them for so long. I think that, again, I also feel like this is a transformative moment and that this could, if it lasts, have an impact on human rights politics more broadly. But I'm also concerned from another standpoint, having laid this out for you, which is the way that human rights politics is now operating in the digital age. And having looked at Egypt and Tunisia to a lesser extent over the last decade, I'm very concerned about some of these dynamics and how they can obscure this essential moral or the moral essence of the struggle. So when the protests began, Iranians were able to finally bring to light their core morally rooted aspirations in a way that was compelling and gave weight to the words freedom and human rights, given how light they had become in the post 9/11 era, particular when used in relation to the Middle East. Yet, just as their battle against the regime and its coercive forces persists, the battle to prevent the moral clarity behind their struggles also persists. As I found in my research on human rights politics of the Arab uprisings, a flurry of claims and counterclaims, co-optation of slogans and narratives, hyper-partisan human rights claims fueled by polarization, and existing polarization within various Iranian political groups, but also state-sponsored polarization, can all combine to create a moral maze. And to the extent that there are numerous state actors, and non-state actors, but numerous state actors, the Iranian regime, Arab rivals, the Israeli government, all of whom have some investment in obscuring the message in one way or another to their benefit. And the way that this is all, disinformation and misinformation around human rights has taken shape over the last decade online. There are many, many opportunities and avenues for that essential moral, character of these protests to be obscured and muddied once again. So that is what I am most concerned about, and looking with anticipation to see if we are able to maintain what we started with, the way that these protesters, and particularly women, were able to capture the world's attention to focus on the very kind of just cause that they have that for so long has been obscured. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.